Hello again, my name is Nick, and thanks for joining me in this series, Jesus and the Gospels. This part of our lesson is actually being split into two separate sections because we're tackling about 800 years of history at an extremely rapid pace. And even though this is an introduction class, it is not in any of our best interests to be bombarded with information overload. So in part one of this leading up to the first century and the arrival of Jesus, we're going to begin with the Babylonian exile and work our way through one of history's most fascinating warlords, Alexander the Great, and how God used him to pave the way for the expansion of Christianity in the first century and beyond. Look carefully at this picture. What do you see? What you are looking at is an ancient manuscript written in capital letters, no spaces, no punctuation, no paragraphs, no verse marks, just lines. If you were to read something like this today, in one of our books, you probably wouldn't be reading very long because you wouldn't know where to start or stop, or how to make out many of the words. Here's a famous example of what I'm talking about. The statement provided there says, Jesus is now here, or Jesus is nowhere. What do those words say or mean? So the fact of understanding a text like this is understanding what is going on. You probably won't be surprised when I tell you that what you're looking at is an ancient manuscript from the New Testament. And this example reminds us of something that is critically important, that the past is like a foreign country to us, because they did things far differently than we do now. So if we want to enter into the world of the New Testament, then we must begin to think like they did and explore their history, their culture, and the way that they did things, and why they did things the way they did. So depending on which tradition you are from, whether it would be Orthodox, Catholic, or in this case if you're a Protestant, if you're reading through your Bible and you finish the last chapter of Malachi, and you flip over to the book of Matthew, you have to remember that there is a whole lot of history that took place between those books. And we may not sometimes realize this, but the whole Jewish landscape shifted between those pages. So in this lesson, we're going to begin with the history that led up to Jesus. This is a picture of the Persian Empire around the 6th century BC. Towards the end of the Old Testament period, the dominant power in the ancient Near East was still the Medo-Persian Empire. But when we open our Bibles to the New Testament, some 400 years have passed since the last book of the Old Testament was written. And the Roman Empire is now in control of the entire Mediterranean region. This part of our series isn't essential to understanding the world that Jesus lived in, but it is helpful. And that's what we're going to explore here. So again, I want to bring us back into that world and the history that shaped the first century, so we can better understand the history and life of the New Testament person from their religion, culture, political, and social statuses. So looking at this map, you can see the size and depth of the Persian Empire. After we explore the Persian Empire, we're going to move into the Greek period, the Ptolemaic domination of Israel, the Maccabean revolt, and finally, Herod the Great. Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Israel, or the elite people such as wise men, scholars, writers, and so on, were deported to Babylonia. This was actually done in 3 separate waves. Wave 1 would have been around the year 605 BC, where people like Daniel were taken to Babylon. A second wave of the deportation took place in 597 BC, and people like Ezekiel would have been included in this, and King Jeconiah. So Daniel had already been in Babylon for 8 years by this time. The third and final wave was in 586 BC, after Jerusalem was burned down and destroyed. The last major historical event of the Old Testament is the return of the Babylonian exiles to Israel under the Persian rule of Cyrus the Great. After conquering Babylon in 539 BC, Cyrus issued a series of decrees allowing the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild the city and temple. This is the second temple that was around during the time of Jesus. About 42,000 returned to Israel with Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple. This is found in Ezra 1 through 6. Now you have to remember that this was not a massive exodus from Babylon back to Jerusalem, because a full generation had passed and many of the Jews living in Babylon were happy where they were. It would be much like immigrant families we see that come to America today, whose children were born here and only know this as their home, and then asking them to leave the comfy confines of where they're at and go back to a country that was completely desolated for 70 years or so. In this series, I strive to be fair to all different traditions and positions with regard to Christianity. On this graph, you can see that I have the intertestamental period, or what is sometimes known in Protestant circles as the period of silence, or the 400 years where no one spoke. That would be from, on the left side of the screen, 430 BC when Malachi was finished and compiled, to the birth of Christ around the year 4 BC. You also have below that the Second Temple period. Now this spans from 516 BC, when the Second Temple was completed, to its destruction in the year 70 AD under the Roman general Titus. With regard to the period of silence, I would like to address that the Orthodox, Coptic, and Catholic churches include many writings during this time period which are included in the canon of Scripture. Some of these works are Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and numerous others. The reason for their inclusion, and I know I'm giving an apologetic defense here, is because they were included in the LXX, or the Greek Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament from the Aramaic into the lingua franca of the time, Greek. And it's important to underscore that when the New Testament writers are making quotations from the Old Testament into, say, the Gospels or the Epistles, they are doing so from the LXX. Sometimes it is argued that these intertestamental books or apocryphal books should not be included in the canon because Jesus never quoted from them. But as the great textual critic Bruce Metzger once pointed out, Jesus never quoted from many Old Testament books that are included in the Protestant canon. So do we remove them? Of course not. And it's important to underscore that Jesus did in fact quote directly from Tobit in Mark 12, where Jesus is actually challenged about 7 brothers that died consecutively. Now, this is a direct quotation from the book of Tobit, and Jesus never took the time to refute it, saying that it was an invalid story. Now, of course, there are many others, but we're not going to get into that here. But to argue for the period of silence seems to me to be circular reasoning, because the very thing people are asserting is what they're trying to prove. And finally, how does someone know or have the authority to say that God was silent during that time period? Where do you find that? It is simply assumed. The Greek period, 334 to 166 BC. Without a doubt, of all the famous military commanders to ever exist, Alexander the Great is always mentioned first. The guy was a military genius and a true warrior. Shortly after his father's assassination in 336 BC, and his father's dream to destroy the Persian Empire, Alexander quickly and strategically consolidated military forces, and at the age of 20, his armies swept from Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Persia, and Babylon. Alexander wanted to keep going east into India until he ran into an army of nearly 500,000 Indians equipped with elephants compared to his 40,000 soldiers. Shortly after he wisely decided to turn back, he mysteriously died in Babylon just a month short of his 33rd birthday. No one knows for sure what happened, but we do know that he was intoxicated with alcohol and likely died from a combination of drunkenness and malaria. So why is Alexander so important from a biblical perspective? So here's a map of Alexander's kingdom. Now, what was interesting and genius about Alexander was that he left his imprint everywhere he went. And Alexander had a deep affection for all things Greek. And he sought to introduce that throughout the cities and territories that he conquered, he would build theaters, public baths, and gymnasiums in these cities, and above all, he left Greek culture everywhere he went. He would also leave soldiers in these conquered cities and encourage them to marry the local women. And with regards to religion, the Greeks were all-inclusive, or accepting of other religions, as long as they would simply absorb them into the pantheon of gods and deities. And all they asked in return was that you conform to a Greek lifestyle. This is known as Hellenization, or Hellas, which means Greek. And Hellenization refers to the spread of the Greek language and culture.
He wasn't just pretending. He was trying to find out more about himself.
By the late 4th century BC, Greek cities were springing up in the wake of Alexander's marauding army. These cities served as centers of control and administration. But more importantly, they became a means of spreading a unifying fabric of Greek language, culture, and learning. The result would be a template of city engineering that would extend to the farthest regions of Alexander's empire.
Alexander ordered that his soldiers be clean-shaven so that enemies couldn't grab their beards in close combat.
By 325 BC, Alexander had extended his borders almost 3,000 miles from Greece in the west to modern-day India in the east. Alexander's army may have been a wrecking machine, but the legacy his empire left in its wake was a new Greek world. Alexander's strategy for ruling conquered nations included both accommodation and assimilation. He often left soldiers behind to marry local women and act as officials in his growing empire. Towns that were formerly Persian, Egyptian, or Indian were transformed into Greek cities. It was an invasion of ideals that formed a hybrid culture that became known as Hellenism.
So definitely there are striking parallels with what's going on today, in our today era of globalization. Today we have a common language, which is English, is the language of trade. After Alexander the Great, you have people who have adopted the Greek customs and the Greek language.
Hellenism was built on city life, and nowhere did this expansion of Greek domination show up more so than in city planning. Whether they were beginning a new city or reshaping an old one, as the empire grew, Alexander's engineers laid it out on a grid plan that the Greeks had used since the 5th century BC.
The grid plan, which was used in these cities, was a symbol of order. Any government that could replace the traditional winding alleyways of a city with a rectilineal grid plan of streets at right angles was a government to be feared, a government to take notice of.
Alexander's campaigns in Asia Minor would create a new world order. Today we call it Hellenism. If you lived in a city conquered by Alexander, you lived in a Greek city. This is an example of such a city. It's called Pergamum.
Hellenization, or Greek culture. How was Israel affected by Hellenization? Well, virtually every inhabited area of Israel conformed to Greek culture. In fact, many Jews, specifically the upper class, wholly embraced Greek culture. Some, however, who are known as the pious Jews, opposed Greek culture. There was so much Greek influence on the culture that sometime around the year 200 to 150 BC, the Hebrew Bible, as we already pointed out, was translated into Koine Greek, which is known as LXX or the Septuagint, and this left an indelible mark on the Jews right into the 1st century AD. Because when you read the New Testament, as I pointed out, nearly 100% of the quotes from Jesus to Peter to Paul are all quoting from the Old Testament, but they're doing it from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Even many of the works that shed light on the New Testament documents, like Maccabees, Sirach, or Wisdom of Solomon, were mainly copied into Greek. And as you may or may not know, the New Testament and all ancient manuscripts that we possess, from our earliest and best, are written in Greek. So why is this so important when we get into the first century and the spread of the gospel? Now remember that after Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is split to 4 of his main army generals. And this is what we're going to pick up on in part 2 of how Greek culture helped with the spread of the gospel.